Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. We saw each other, at least for some of you, yesterday. So I hope the weekend is going well and that you are interested in the topic of this video, which is namely the topic of discovering you're not an INFJ. Now this could, by extension, apply to any person of any type discovering they're not of that type, but we'll focus on the INFJ example here as per the main thematic focus of this channel. Now, before I move on to my topic, just remember that I have 2 books available below in the description box if you're interested in analysis of the INFJ, the deepest that you can find online, the Ecstatic Soul, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle. If you're interested in fiction and want to support my fictional work, that would be amazing. I've gotten very good feedback on this book so far. It's also available for less than $10 in the links below. So, discovering that you're not an INFJ. What does that even mean? I think that, there's many of us have had the experience of discovering that we're not of a certain type. For example, I'll give you a very kind of straightforward, direct example. Like for about a year after I discovered MBTI for the first time, a year or even, maybe a little bit less than a year, but almost a year, I thought I was an INTP. And it was quite a shock to realize that after all, reading up on the cognitive functions and so on, it appeared much more likely that I was an INFJ who strongly identified for any number of reasons with the thinking function, but nevertheless that thinking function was probably tertiary and so on and so forth, and everything else just made a lot more sense, and there was something very liberating. And I'm sure there are some of you that have had this experience of first identifying as a certain type that seemed to resonate, but not completely, in such a way that you kind of felt connected to that type, but not at an emotional level. And then when you find what you believe is your true type, there's an emotional connection that happens. And yet, it's a harsh truth that your type, can always be endlessly rediscovered and questioned. Now, the outcome of that questioning is not necessarily identifying as another type altogether. It can just be refining the understanding of the specific type of INFJ you are. We know that there are quite a few subtypes of INFJs. They're the more TI heavy INFJs, the more FE heavy INFJs, the more introverted ones, the more extroverted ones, and INFJs in all different kinds of jobs that will have an influence on their personality to a degree that's not negligible. All these things happen. But what if you find yourself in a situation where you have good reasons to believe that you're not an INFJ after all? Well, I think that there's a couple of ways of exploring this question. The first question to ask is, what is the resource that you hit upon giving you some convincing insight that you're not an INFJ? Okay, you're another type, and you can further assess the credibility of the source by how impartial it is. If it's not trying to upset you in any way, if it's just objectively telling you, model's telling you, on the basis of X, Y, and Z. A lot of people get typing services these days, so they probably are. It's likely that some of you will have talked to certain coaches that might have told you, well, you're maybe completely other type than INFJ, or a slightly different type. It's same cognitive functions but different order, something like that. So the first thing to consider is that this might not be enough grounds for a complete existential transition with the crises that come with it a lot of the time, and the upheavals and everything. For the very simple reason that models are based on theories. A model that is not informed by a theory has no meaning injected into it and doesn't really mean anything, okay? So you have the underlying theory, and you notice that that's the case with models of personality that you can take seriously. So for example, people who provide coaching lessons or coaching courses and typing courses and sessions these days will tell you either that they rely explicitly on the MBTI framework, which itself takes, to a large extent, its theory to be Jung, in a traditional sort of sense. Then you have other models that have other theories, such as Harry CPT's. There's a reason why he's written books on the topic where he elaborates the theory. Michael Pierce has written a book where he develops his own theory, although I don't know if he provides typing sessions. In theory, he could, no pun intended. You have, of course, the very excellent and forward-thinking cognitive typology, cognitive type. Again, that's the tautology, and a lot of people know about the typing by microexpressions and are puzzled by it. A lot of people are, but people don't realize that there's a theory behind it. Again, Auburn, the creator, he has a book, and he has multiple books coming up. So if you check their channel, you will hear more about that. But there's also a very detailed website with a wealth of information about the theory that injects the meaning into the whole point of tautology and other aspects of it. And I could take more examples. Even a model that I'm not a massive fan of personally, like C.S. Joseph, has some theoretical underpinnings, including in the work of other authors, John Beebe and others. So these are other theories. Now, if these models, you could use socionics as another example. If these models type you as something else than INFJ, does that mean that you're not INFJ? Well, the point that I want to make, and it's not intuitive, it seems to be intuitive for some people, and it's a bit less intuitive for the other people. But the point that I want to make is that you could perfectly well still be INFJ, as long as you identify as INFJ in the MBTI model. Why is that the case? How come you could be, let's say, and I'll use my own example. So for example, in cognitive type, I type as FENI. Now you want to say that's ENFJ. Well, I mean, if we think FENI in that order, in the MBTI parlance, that would be ENFJ. But the cognitive type theory, just like a lot of these other theories that are not MBTI theory, use terms and conceptualize categories in a way that is not exactly the same as MBTI. And so it's quite natural that people end up typing differently in those models. I mean, the core insight of this is that the type that you're provided in these other models covers a territory that is likely to overlap with the type that it seems to mirror in the MBTI. So NIFE and INFJ, for example. But it's like the territory is only overlapping. It's not a complete one-to-one correspondence. So in other words, you could be an FENI in one model, or FENI, whatever other symbol, I don't want to refer to cognitive type specifically, and still identify as INFJ or something else in MBTI, because there's some overlap, but it's not one-to-one correspondence. You have to understand that if there was one-to-one correspondence, well, there's a very likely chance that the theory that's in some sense competing with MBTI would have no reason to be, because it would be essentially saying we're replicating the MBTI theory. If the end results, if the typing provided are exactly the same in terms of their conceptual demarcation, then the new theory, the competing theory, is not adding anything new. What they could claim, what the new theory could claim, is to have a methodology, specifically an empirical methodology of determining people's types, that is more reliable than the MBTI methodology. And it is true that the MBTI methodology, I would argue, unlike the theory, the methodology of MBTI is it's very vague and weak. We don't really know. We do self-exploration through questionnaires. That's arguably the worst, but self-exploration given, of cognitive functions is better, but it will always involve the biases that come from self-perception. So objective analyses are, if they can be achieved, are necessarily going to be more objective and more reliable. But that's not to make a point about the theory. That's merely the methodology. If the theory itself is different, as it is the case with these other models, then of course you're not going to have demarcations of types that are the same as the original theory. Otherwise, they're redundant. So that makes clear in a very straightforward sense that the type that you get in other models does not necessarily oblige you or demand that you change your type in the MBTI model. And I think it's a pretty straightforward point to understand. The one case where it seems that it would be difficult to hold on to your INFJ typing if you get typed as things other than your type in other models is if there is the suggestion that really you're using completely different cognitive functions. Like say you identify as INFJ and then many other models type you as using, say, like ENFP functions, or ISTJ functions, same as the ENFP functions, FITE, NESI. If other models consistently type you as having those functions, then it creates more strain on the identification with your original and INFJ typing, because it seems there's no overlap, So if there's no overlap, then that's a problem. And this is a situation typically where, okay, you can start asking yourself, could I be mistyped? Could I be something else than INFJ? And I've been relating to the INFJ label, and not more than just the label, the INFJ worldview concept, sometimes for years, sometimes for many years. So how do I deal with it? I think that it would be understandable and not a source of shame to have an initial resistance to the idea, and it's fair to consider that perhaps whoever else typed you may have gotten it wrong. There's no reason to assume that they have an exact science, and that they are free from the possibility of making mistakes. I think in these cases, and if you have those doubts, it makes sense to, search for other typing services and see what they say. If you see that they're saying inconsistent things among each other, then you have every reason to stick to your INFJ typing, which is what you associate with, because there's no agreement among the other alternatives. If you see there is agreement among the other alternatives, at least in terms of their typings won't exactly be equivalent to each other, but they might map on to the same set of functions. If those set of functions are very different from the INFJ functions, then you have reason to make the step of considering that INFJ might not be the type that captures your best. And I understand that it might be a painful process. It might be an emotionally difficult process, because you might have become very attached to the INFJ personality concept. But I think that one way to look at it is to say, clearly there's something about the INFJ personality that I resonate with, but it might not actually be the cognitive makeup of the INFJ that I relate with. So it would be very interesting to kind of research what are the aspects of the INFJ that you actually relate with, even if you're not. There's a lot of people of other types that are attracted to INFJs, get on well with INFJs, probably because there's a lot in common there, and it might not be domains and terrain that's captured by the cognitive model. It might be other things, because as we know, our personalities are much more than just our cognitive makeup. And so perhaps what you relate to in the INFJ descriptions are things that maybe derive from the cognitive makeup in some way, but are not actually part and reducible to the cognitive makeup. And so that would be a very interesting path in itself to try to discover what that is. And the other thing that could be very enriching if you manage to turn around your perspective from a sort of negative to a positive one, is to say, wow, this other type that I might actually be closer to in the MBTI world. What is this type? Maybe I've been, underestimating it so far. Maybe I've been not giving it a chance to explore it, and if you explore it in more detail, and then maybe some descriptions you read, and you overcome the sort of predisposition not to identify with that type, you might realize there's a whole new world out there that is waiting for you, and more discovery along the way. It's a difficult path, it's an emotionally challenging path, as I said, but ultimately I believe that it's very liberating. And if there's any among you who've been through there, or who've been through the experiences I described before, I'd be very curious to know. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, guys. Bye-bye.